Thank you so much, Kenton, Maya, Xiao, and Sheena for that fascinating conversation. It is a reminder of everyone's desire, and indeed right, to connect with each other, exchange ideas, and express themselves. It is also a stark reminder of how authoritarian governments increasingly depend on technological innovation to suppress those rights and maintain power. Our next conversation is about leading efforts in the European Union to build rules of the road in democratic and open societies. I'm happy to turn over to Rose Jackson to lead the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with two people we've had the pleasure of working with over the past few years as they've drafted and shepherded Europe's new twin regulations into force. As we've been tracking closely here at DFR Lab, the European Union has enacted the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act, which combined amount to the most significant democratically aligned rewriting of the rules of the global internet. And while they are EU regulations, they focus on what are called very large platforms, meaning an increasingly incongruous global regulatory environment meets the combined power of the EU, focusing on the far reach of large platforms. And that has really significant implications for how the internet may exist for everyone around the world. We're honored to be joined here today by Gerard de Graaf, who's the European Union's first ambassador to Silicon Valley, and his colleague Prabhat Agarwal, the head of the European Commission's Digital Services and Platforms Unit. Gentlemen, welcome back to DFR Lab and the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Rose.
Thank you again. We keep saying we've had the pleasure of having you guys over the course of this whole process, from the conception of the DSA and DMA through the negotiations and consultations, the passage, and now we're into the implementation stage. So I suppose I should kick this off just by asking, what comes next? We now have, Gerard, you've recently started this new office in Silicon Valley. Prabhat, you're focusing back in Brussels on really important questions around implementation. What should we be paying attention to over the next few months and year?
You know, we're building, Rose, thanks for the question. We're building up our new structure here, and it's quite an exciting period, actually. Building something new is always something very exciting, also obviously challenging, but we had a very good teams to start with throughout the work on the Digital Services Act, which is important to say didn't just start 2 or 3 years ago. You know, we had many years before. We already started to work on self and co-regulatory actions in the European Union, and so we've been working very closely on this topic for a long period of time. So it's really exciting to fold all of this knowledge now into a scale up, and it feels a bit like a startup ourselves, actually. So that's a bit the atmosphere. We moved into new offices here, which look like a startup office, and we're recruiting new people. We've got a call out there until the 19th of December for external staff. We're recruiting internally. So that's what we're building right now. So just to answer your question, what should you be looking out for? So we're going to be a bit quiet, outward looking for the next couple of months, while we build this team and we set up our structures, and then we build our capacity. So that's where we are at the moment.
Excellent. Gerard?
Well, we are definitely a startup because we're new and we're small, much smaller, of course, than the resources that are available in Brussels. We're now 4. We started on the 1st of September, and the focus is broader than DSA and DMA. It's part of the digital diplomacy. So we're looking at, say, the full kind of extent of the digital activities in the European Union, and also kind of how the European Union is building up its capacities in technology, and how it's kind of developing policies from digital skills all the way to kind of major investments in connectivity and in quantum and in other technologies. But obviously with the DSA and the DMA, and there is a strong interest here in Silicon Valley. And I think what we have noticed is that, because we have conversations at different levels, of course, with the companies that are most likely going to be designated as very large online platforms or gatekeepers. And I think here, there's a clear understanding that the negotiations are behind us, that, not everything maybe that is in the legislation is what the particular companies would have wanted to be in the legislation, but the focus is now quite clearly on implementation and on compliance. And I think it's in those discussions that we can help. I mean, what are the challenges that these companies face, and how can these kind of challenges be overcome before the measures actually enter into application, because they're into force now. But of course, there's still a little bit of time ahead of us before the measures will actually have to be complied with in practice. So this is the kind of conversations which we are having with big tech here in Silicon Valley. I mean, maybe a little bit more initially the attention on the DMA, on the DSA. I think we're now seeing kind of an acceleration and about kind of, okay, so also on the DSA, we probably have more to do, even though we are already doing a lot. So maybe there's a little bit of an underestimation on the DSA, what has to be done to comply fully with the requirements in the DSA. I mean, on the other hand, we have a lot of discussions also with like civil society, with academia, etc. And I think here the main takeaway for us is that there's actually quite not only strong interest, but quite a high degree of convergence at what the EU is doing makes sense. I mean, let's see how it then kind of turns out when it's implemented. But I mean, interestingly, a lot of support, which we had not expected as much for the approach that we have taken. And then last, but definitely not least, we've begun initial contacts also with the legislature in Sacramento, of course, with the midterms. I mean, they are now looking at kind of reconstituting the chambers for the next session, but also there we have detected quite some interest and some kind of looking at Europe as a source of inspiration for possible further reflection and action here in California. So that's like in a nutshell the experience that we have since we opened about 3 months ago.
Very, very busy. And I should say you opened at a really interesting moment for the US tech industry. We'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we're talking at a time that Twitter's in the news quite a bit. There have been massive tech layoffs. And I think it brings to the fore questions around things that I think in the past companies voluntarily did, whether we're talking about access to information and an understanding of what's happening on a platform, questions around transparency and data access, an understanding of certain policies and approaches to ensuring that the digital environment that we live on is secure and safe and dependable. I'm curious, as that's been transpiring, are you seeing companies at this moment come to you looking for advice on how to do things? Are they getting more serious about what those implementation questions might look like? And on the flip side, Prabhat, as you're recruiting hundreds of new people into a completely new function, are you finding that there are the right mixes of people able to come join and answer these questions? What is that ecosystem looking like at a moment that feels, I'd say, pretty up in the air?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Rose, maybe I forgot to mention one big milestone coming up on the 17th of February next year. So February 17th is really the date when platforms have to publish their user numbers. And that's a really important milestone. So it's something I wanted to throw out there, because that's going to be the basis on which we are going to determine which ones are the large platforms that you mentioned and which ones are the not so large ones. So that's a really important marker down there. In terms of the recruitment, I think we see an uptick in interest also from people who worked in the tech sector and now interested in coming to join and work with us as a regulator. That's very interesting, and we've definitely seen a very large increase in interest. It's a bit early to see the mix of profiles, so we have set up also, I wanted to say, a center in Spain called the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, and they're particularly focused on data science profiles, and they've seen quite a lot of interest as well. So I think overall, I'm quite optimistic. There are a lot of interested people out there, people who used to work for tech or who have a tech background as well, but also people who just love to do something, in this space and as a force for good. I think that's something that we really certainly see. So we understand that companies are going through increasingly economically challenging times. This is something we are aware of. Economic situations are going to be tough. I mean, we are going through a cold winter here in the European Union. You cannot tell, but normally I run around with a sweater, but I took it off for this for this because the buildings are cold here in Europe, and the heating is turned down, and people feel it in Europe that this is going to be a cold winter, and many people are still taking in Ukrainian refugees. So the circumstances, not only for the tech industry, but the global economy is under pressure. We understand that. At the same time, the rules under the DSA and the DMA are not optional. They have to be factored in. Compliance has to be accounted for in these companies, and this is not something we can negotiate away or down. And what we're saying to companies is that this investment is important because first of all, it's you only have to do this once for the whole European Union, whereas before the Digital Services Act and also before the Digital Markets Act, there was a kind of mushrooming of different national laws that would have actually had a much higher compliance cost if you add them all up. Having 27 different hoops that you have to jump through in order to do business in the European Union. That's not good for any business. So at least we have a single unified framework. We also see some indications from companies who are telling us that they would like to use this framework as the global framework that they have for just cost reasons, which we appreciate. So those are some elements of our conversations that I can share, I think, without breaching any of the confidentiality on these around these conversations.
That's really helpful. And Gerard, I'm wondering how you're experiencing it in Silicon Valley. Are you surprised by any of the questions and conversations that you're getting, or the reactions from industry that you may have expected to be different?
Well, I mean, not really. I think not major surprises. I think what is also interesting, I mean, obviously a lot of the attention goes to like the very large online platforms and the potential gatekeepers, but we have seen also a lot of interest and actually companies coming to us that see benefit, particularly in the Digital Markets Act. So this is an interesting dynamic. I mean, sometimes we portray the dynamic as like big tech versus, like, we'll call it the regulator, in this case, the European regulator, but it's actually big tech also versus each other. I mean, when we talk to some of these gatekeepers, they quite like some of the provisions because it might improve actually the conditions of access for themselves in particular markets, even though they might be less enthusiastic about provisions that kind of are more relevant to their own business model. So also there's an interesting dynamic between the gatekeepers, and some of the gatekeepers are coming to us and say, well, please make sure that for that other gatekeeper, the particular provisions are complied with, because that's important to our future business. And then the smaller ones are also kind of increasingly becoming active and kind of actually telling us, look, we are watching this. We are really relying on the European Union framework to overcome some of, say, the unfair practices that we've been suffering from for too long. So that's an interesting dynamic. It isn't like one side against the other side. If you can portray it, I mean, a regulator is never against kind of the regulated. And I think that's another, I think, important feature, is that we need a constructive relationship. And I think part of this is now being kind of developed. I mean, there's a lot of like pre-notification, I mean, upstream meetings with the platforms also. I mean, Prabhat and the colleagues in Brussels, we have some of these meetings here where a lot of these issues are discussed, are explored. I mean, guidance, I mean, the soft guidance given. And so that builds a constructive relationship between the regulator and those who will ultimately be regulated by the regulator. So I think from that perspective, positive. On the issue of employment, I mean, so of course something that we've looked at. I mean, some of the companies have reassured us that obviously, I mean, they pay particular attention when they do let people go, that it will not affect their capacity to implement, or at least to moderate content and to then implement also the DSA and the DMA. So I think there's also in the industry, there is an awareness that it's probably not so wise to start cutting into the areas where, frankly, you probably now need to step up rather than reduce your resources. So, but there are always kind of issues. I mean, you're of course aware of the one that probably is on everybody's mind, where there's a bit closer attention to what the effects might be on the capacity of that company and other companies to implement the DSA requirements.
Certainly. It's interesting to hear you talk about, and unsurprising, obviously, the kind of different parts of the ecosystem greeting the EU developments in their own way. So whether it's startups or medium-sized industry having their own reactions to the DMA specifically, or various platforms welcoming clarity and continuity on how to approach the entire EU system. I'm curious, now that you have an outpost in the United States, what those conversations are looking like in a context in which the U.S. has been a little bit behind in setting some of these standards. And I know, we can talk a little bit later about, obviously, the TTC and a number of other things that the EU is working on in this broader digital ecosystem. But have you found, are there things that you are seeing people work less on because they feel like the EU has got that part covered? Other things that you've heard people in the United States say that they welcome the EU having created a standard on? I'd love to hear a little bit about what it looks like to you as the EU now sitting in the United States, grappling with a lot of these questions, some months and years behind where you are.
Well, I mean, over the last few years, I mean, we've been in close touch with the US as well as with other countries, but particularly with the US, and then particularly in the context of the Trade and the Technology Council, even whilst we were still conceiving and the negotiations were ongoing. So, and vice versa, the US has kept us very closely informed about its own initiatives, some of the executive orders that we've seen, and also the developments on the Hill, even though, of course, we know that it's difficult to get things agreed and passed on Capitol Hill for reasons which I think are wider than just the digital area. So in terms of problem analysis, in terms of direction, I think there's a high degree of convergence between the US administration and the EU. So that, I mean, yeah, maybe some things would have been done differently. I mean, we have a different political, legal tradition. So I mean, I don't think, I mean, anybody would be contemplating that the US would implement a similar version of the DSA and the DMA. But I think if the political capacity were there to do something in this area, then it would not be very dissimilar from what the EU has done in this area. Maybe not as comprehensive. So I think that's a positive. That means that I think and also positive towards the rest of the world, particularly also in the context of the DSA and the DMA and what's happening geostrategically. I mean, in terms of the implementation, of course, part of what is in the DSA will also bring, well, if I may say so, benefits outside. I mean, the risk management approach, of course, will, I mean, be done from a European perspective, but it will also kind of provide insights to third countries and of course, actors in third countries as to how these platforms are managing these risks. I mean, the transparency reporting, the access of data that maybe Prabhat can say a few more things about researchers. I mean, if US researchers would be working together with European researchers, I mean, there would be no reason why US researchers could also not benefit from these access provisions in the DSA. So yes, we are regulating for Europe, but de facto and in practice, benefits will already be available to other parts of the world. And then we'll need to see. I mean, the questions that we are dealing with and we've been dealing with at the political level won't go away. How do you make the internet safer, and how do you protect your fundamental rights like freedom of speech? That's a fundamental issue that is being discussed in many, many parts of the world, and including in this country. That problem is not going to go away. Maybe the capacity is not there to deal with the issue at political level at the moment, but at some point that problem will need to be answered. And I think this is where the EU is now, the answers have now been given by the EU, and then other countries will need to think about how they will answer that question and to what extent they can benefit from the experience that the EU has already gained, and now, of course, with the implementation, even more how it will produce effect in society and in the market.
Certainly. And you mentioned the question of transparency and data access, which obviously the DFR Lab has particular interest in as open source researchers in the digital ecosystem. But I appreciated in the past that both of you have characterized the EU approach to regulation as acknowledging that it's going to take some adjustment, that it is trying to find the best path, adjusting, learning, and growing as you discover more, which certainly looks a little bit different than in the US, where we kind of have to get something on the books and that's your last cut. So I'm curious, Prabhat, particularly on the question of researcher access, data access, defining what transparency means for these platforms. What do you see both as most urgent? What are the things that you're hoping to give quickest attention to in defining? And where is it that communities like ours can plug in most productively as you're making these foundational decisions that will impact American researchers as well as a researcher in Kenya or Malaysia or anywhere in the world?
So the transparency piece in the DSA is kind of multifaceted. And what I usually like to say is there are kind of three parts to it. It's transparency towards the user, the normal user, and that needs to be simple language to understand, how the platform works, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And there the Digital Services Act makes some new rules. For example, the terms and conditions have to be so easy to understand that even children can understand them. So this is not the case right now. There are many jokes in the European Union about the length of terms and conditions that everybody clicks away. There's even an opera which is 3 hours long, somebody singing the Facebook terms and conditions. So that's something that is being regulated. And user-facing transparency also includes meta information about what happens when your content gets moderated, what kind of ways you have to complain about that and to get your content back online, that kind of stuff. There's a second piece, which is the kind of transparency for public scrutiny. So those are experts in the public, either journalists or NGOs or organizations such as yours, who kind of, take a bit of a closer look at what's happening on a platform, and they usually employ experts in the public domain. And so that's kind of what you could label kind of expert transparency. And these are the people who read transparency reports. I mean, normal users probably don't, or the majority. And they try and figure out what's going on well on the platform. So that's kind of expert transparency. And there we have a very far-reaching new rule, which is to extend that expert transparency to also academic researchers or independent researchers need to be vetted by a regulator and the research they carry out has to be linked to one of the risks. So it's not just anything, I have a research project, I want to get data from the platform, but it has to be linked to a risk in the European Union. But this is true. This provision hasn't got any geographical boundary, and so we've got a bit of time. It's about a year project, so this provision will become active in spring 2024. So we're kicking off this project right now, and there will be quite an extensive consultation and workshops. And it's also an area where we are working together with our US partners under the Trade and Technology Council, but also with a wider academic community. And we are hoping to have a kind of inclusive and transparent and collaborative process around designing that so that it works for regulators, it works for researchers, and it gives that additional expert scrutiny that we think is really critical. There's a third part of our transparency piece, which is actually transparency towards the regulator. And that's usually, that's really looking under the hood of the car, if you like the analogy, and that gives, powers to the regulator to inspect what's going on inside the platforms. And that's an additional layer. Of course, all these three pieces play together, but this is a little bit how we think around about transparency in the Digital Services Act.
That's really helpful, and I know that a lot of the folks watching today are going to be interested in following up on that. So we'll do our best to help connect people from the community into that process. I wonder if we can take some time as well, though. I know that the EU writ large is working on so many different fronts, and so one question that comes up quite often is you went through this really long and very thorough process to develop the DSA and DMA, setting up these kind of core rules and standards. And then, of course, the next day, someone will ask a question about, well, what about immersive contexts? What about health tech? What about quantum? On and on and on and on. And I'm curious if you can speak to the ways that both of you, as well as the broader kind of EU ecosystem, is thinking about approaching future tech. How much of this is applying what you just built towards things that are coming? How much is needing to find where other parts of existing rules and laws apply in a digital context? And how do we collaboratively as a community work to ensure that as the internet changes quickly, the way that the public sector is able to ensure that public interest is reflected in that development creates a better digital world for everyone? A really easy question for me to throw at you. I'll start with Gerard.
Maybe, I mean, I think first of all, I mean, this kind of mandate of this commission, of this European Parliament, I think is really about digital and green and climate change. I mean, those are the two priorities. And so that's like why the European Union is now pushing forward like almost comprehensively, I mean, holistically on a number of fronts. The DSA and the DMA have been adopted, are now about to be implemented. And we have the AI Act, we have the Data Act, we have measures on cybersecurity, we have the digital wallet, we have a lot of other things coming down the pike. So, but that, I think once we have done all of this, and we're now looking like 1.5 years from now is the next European election. So, I mean, we want to get all of this past the post and then implemented so that, say, the next phase, say, as of when 2024 is really an implementation phase. I don't think you will see, I mean, another wave of regulation coming out of the European Union as you have seen over the last kind of couple of years. Of course, we need to show that we can implement it. The proof of the pudding is always in the eating, is not in the preparation of the pudding. And then, I mean, what we have put in place is a foundation. This is kind of the horizontal elements, and it may well be, I mean, we are always regulating in a technology neutral way. I mean, if you look at the DSA, if you look at the DMA, we don't regulate the technologies. We regulate certain behavior, certain practices, I mean, certain disciplines. So also you remember the Electronic Commerce Directive, I mean, is now 22 years old. It will continue to exist. This is where the conditional liability provisions, for example, are integrated into. So we are quite confident, although you never know, that this framework of legislation will stand the test of time. I mean, how long? I mean, 20 years, maybe not, but definitely for, say, the next 10 years, it should be kind of okay. And then, I mean, it might be that, like you would have vertically, you will need in specific sectors, you will need to complement. I mean, we have the general product safety regulation, for example. It's based very largely on the DSA in terms of like certainly online marketplaces. But then you might need to go a little further in an area that is sectoral, whereas it rests on the horizontal. So it might be in medtech or in fintech or in financial services, AI. You might need to kind of make a little tweak because of the particularities of this sector. But again, the underlying foundation will be the AI Act, will be the Data Act, will be the DSA, will be the DMA. So that's the way I think we see the future. And I mean, we'll have to see whether kind of to what kind of new challenges will arise. I mean, the metaverse, our line is the DSA and the DMA and everything else will apply to the metaverse, which we will probably not call the metaverse. We will call it like extended reality or immersive reality. So that's another, I think, very important principle, that we don't think kind of what we're doing is irrelevant to further technology development that is kind of already underway. No, I mean, the metaverse will have to comply with the DSA as much as kind of current state of technology will need to comply with the DSA.
Prabhat, how much is that weighing into the process of designing the implementation itself, and how you're thinking about what it is that you're asking of companies or making sure is apparent to users?
Well, it does play a role. I mean, of course, we are now in the conversations we're having with companies, we're kind of making the reality check of how these rules now work with the specifics of a particular service or a particular company. That's ongoing, and you know that's clearly something that we're also contains a forward-looking element. You know, how will some of these services evolve in the future? I think so far, you know, we haven't really encountered any major problems of something that is obviously completely, you know, completely crazy, at least far away from it. You know, there will always be challenging questions because technology is diverse and fast evolving, and not everything can be anticipated. What we have in the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act is actually another provision, which is not a regulatory provision per se. There's an obligation on the Commission to carry out foresight, horizon scanning, forward-looking work to actually anticipate emerging trends, not just because they should be regulated, but just to have this forward-looking. And one interesting provision in the Digital Services Act, in the higher number of the articles that only the experts kind of manage to read up to, is our provisions that say that the Commission has to actually, you know, watch emerging trends together with member states and external experts, you know, and in order to make sure that the legislative framework or the policy framework is future-proof and can evolve. So we're setting that up as well. We already have a prototype for that. It's called an observatory of the online platform economy, and we're reconfiguring that now to take on these new obligations. And that's certainly something we'll be doing, and that will play in our role as well. And I mean, I think it's just 2 points that I don't think that the European Union is out to regulate every piece of tech that's on the planet, you know, and you mentioned quantum earlier. I mean, you know, that's an area where we're making a lot of investments. We have excellent research base in the European Union. And so this is an area where we really are investing a lot. You know, there's no plan for regulation or anything like that as such, you know, and certainly nobody says that the DSA will also regulate quantum technologies and so on. So what we are concerned with is areas where we perceive or we have evidence that there is a risk for society or for the economy, and those are, and we address that. So just to be clear that that is not. I hear this quite a lot, you know, that we're just out there to protect everyone.
Yeah. I'm curious on a similar front. You know, we've talked a fair amount about the kind of precedent setting that the EU approach has, both in terms of the power of it just existing and companies having to respond to it, but also the significant work that went into answering hard questions and finding models of how you do these things. I'm curious how you balance that as someone that is serving the European public, while knowing that you do have this major global role as you are moving forward and implementing these twin regulations. What does it look like to engage with the rest of the world and balance those interests? Are there times that they feel like they're in conflict, or ways that it really feels like it's quite aligned and strengthens the EU position itself just to be a global leader?
A great question, Rose, and I think I need to say that it's true, first of all, that we get a lot of global interest at the moment. So we get a lot of countries asking us for presentations of what we're doing under the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. We are getting a lot of, you know, we're really involved in a lot of bilateral and multilateral kind of discussions and give explanations. What we always stress is that the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are embedded in a very strong fundamental rights framework in the European Union. You know, and it's even in the texts and so on. So this is particularly strong for the Digital Services Act, but it's also relevant for the Digital Markets Act because maybe many of you viewers might not know, but the right to conduct a business is actually a charter protected fundamental right in the European Union. And it actually protects companies from excessive regulatory or arbitrary regulatory burdens, and so this is businesses are protected by our Charter of Fundamental Rights, just in the same way that people's speech is protected. Actually, it's on the same level. This is one thing that is very important as we engage out there in the world, where we know that freedom of expression is not universally respected human right. And so we stress very much when we engage with third countries that our framework is embedded into international human rights norms. I think this also brings me to another element that's very relevant, is that we are partners with a number of countries in the US under the Declaration for the Future of the Internet. And this is precisely because that's an affirmation by more than 60 countries now of the importance of international human rights norms, within which we need to carry out regulatory processes. And we are really advocates and strong supporters of the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, precisely because the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are so deeply embedded in an international human rights framework. And this is one of the things that I'm personally quite proud of, that we believe in. So as we're having these conversations with other countries, we keep stressing that this is it's not just about the content of the rules, but it's also the constitutional framework in which they are embedded. So so that's maybe one thing that I wanted to just point out on top there.
No, that's excellent, and music to our democracy-focused ears, of course, and certainly has changed the dynamic of the conversation I think that countries are having to pin a conversation out of abstraction and into an actual model. And I think sometimes, certainly in the United States, we don't have core regulations on data protection. We don't have much in the way of a kind of cohesive set of standards. And so as we look to different models that the UK is pushing forward, that the Canadian government has pushed forward, India, Brazil, name any number of countries in a more democratic space, let alone the way that the authoritarian world is driving forward its contradictory approach, it's really interesting to watch countries adjust to a new reality in which there is a standard and a stake in the ground. Two kind of closing questions for you. One is, what are you most optimistic about? So this is a huge amount of work that has been pushed through over the last few years. I hope that you managed to get a few naps in, maybe a small vacation before trying to build the entire architecture for implementing it. But what are you most looking forward to and most optimistic about now that you've kind of built this foundation?
Rose, what I'm actually most optimistic about is not so much the tension between the regulator and the platforms under these frameworks, but it's actually under the DSA, the empowerment we give to civil society actors, to advocates, to journalists, to actually scrutinize the system that is so important to our democracies. And I think that this is really what I'm most optimistic about. Of course, we are taking our regulatory powers very seriously, and we will use them, as we are building our structure. This is a very important element. But I think the real power and the thing that makes me optimistic is the ability, particularly of the DSA, to surface data, in a way that has never been done before, and that allows actually to have an evidence-based conversation, a data-based conversation on what's actually going on, and allows then the society, whether it's in the US or in the European Union or elsewhere, to have an informed discussion based on data and facts about how we should address them. So that's actually what I'm really optimistic about, and then our regulatory powers sit on top of that. But the real power of the framework comes actually from empowering others to have a discussion about what our society should look like, when these platforms are such a big part of it, and this is not anti or pro someone, but this is simply saying that we're giving power to the people to understand what's going on, and I think that good things will come from that. That's what I'm most optimistic about.
So I'll take this chance to throw the same question to you, Gerard. What are you most optimistic about now that you've gotten through the main passage of all of these foundational laws and approaches?
Well, I think with the DSA and the DMA and the other kind of regulatory initiatives that are coming down the pike, we have a framework that kind of can help us to build a more positive internet, an internet that kind of brings us together, that kind of no longer divides as much as it sometimes does, that can help underpin and reinforce our democracies, and I think just make us a better society. And then with the DMA, I think we're hopeful we'll see the continuation and an intensification of innovation that this kind of sector of digital is so famous for, but that unfortunately we have not seen maybe as much as we could have had the market been more open. So it's the effects that I think we can be most hopeful about, and that's I think where we need all of us, not just us in the EU, but all stakeholders, including the industry, civil society, academia, I mean, policymakers all over the world, particularly if you see where the internet under threat, if we can offer a positive model that supports our democracy, that brings prosperity, that improves our quality of life, I think that's something that I think holds a lot of hope for the future.
That's all noble goals, and as I've said before, we view very much the digital world as responsible to an ecosystem of people that all have to play their roles. And so we're very excited to have the partnership that we have with both of you and with all of the work that the European Union has put forward. We hope that the civil society community that, as Prabhat alluded to, has to play its role of being an independent verifier and part of its ecosystem, that the industry upon which we rely on for so many things, that this helps create a framework for moving forward. And we very much look forward to partnering with you, and hope that we can have you back on our stage again, and more conversations in the coming months. But thank you for giving of your time, and really excited to see where this goes. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.